All right, class. So today we're going to talk about the financial system. And the financial system is really how physical capital in our country, infrastructure, buildings, new machines, all that, how that's financed. So in today's society, it's usually done by pooling together up other people's money. Now, some companies have the amount of money that they can, build something on their own with just their own savings. But most of the time, any kind of new building, new investment is going to require using other people's money to create that. And we're going to take a look at the mechanics of how that's done. The first thing you need to understand is the difference between savings and investment. So kind of throw away your old definitions of savings investment. We're looking at the macroeconomic definition. Now, savings, that's money that you put into an account, okay? That's, if you were to put money into a bank account, if you were to put money into a stock by buying stock, if you were to put money into a bond by buying a bond, that's you saving your money, okay? And that's pretty the common definition of savings. Investment, though, investment is whenever you are using money to build something else. So when you buy stock, we're not going to call that investing. That's saving. When you put money into a retirement account, that's saving. That's not investing. Okay, investing is borrowing money or using money to build something. You're building a house, you could be building a factory, you could be building new equipment, but you're building physical capital. You're investing by creating something that's going to be used in the future. Okay, so make sure you understand the difference between savings and investment because we have what's called the savings investment identity. And the savings investment identity is basically just the idea that all the money that's saved has to be invested somehow. Okay, so any money that you put into a bank, that bank, in order to make money off it, is eventually going to take that money and lend it out to someone else. They're not just going to let it, sit in their bank and just pay you interest just to let them hold their money. Okay, so all the money that's saved in the economy is then invested into building and buying physical capital into building infrastructure. So just make sure you remember savings equals investment. Now there's different types of savings. We have what's called private savings, and private savings is just what people, what the public saves. So when you put money into your bank account, that's private savings. Okay. There's also government savings, and government savings is going to be whenever we have a budget surplus or a budget deficit. So, just to refresh, budget surplus, that's whenever the government is taking in more in tax revenue than we're spending, so they have leftover money, so to speak. And then a budget deficit is whenever they're spending more money than they're actually taking in tax revenue, and they're having to borrow that to pay off all their expenses. So government savings we also refer to as a budget balance. If we have a budget surplus, that's a positive budget balance. If we have a budget deficit, that's a negative budget balance. And so our private savings plus the government savings is going to equal what's called our national savings. And that's going to be really important when we get to start looking at what's called the loanable funds market. Is just remember, national savings is everything that the public saves plus everything that the government saves, and it might be negative. Private savings you might take private savings plus government savings, and you end up with a smaller national savings because the government savings might be negative. But just remember that equation. So national savings equals private savings plus government savings. Now we also have what are called capital flows, and this is going to be money that's either coming into our country or leaving our country. An inflow is whenever foreign money is coming into a country for investment spending. So when another country is sending their money to the US, and they might be buying some kind of like stock or something, but then we're using that money to build something for investment spending, okay? Whereas capital outflows is when money is leaving a country for investment spending in another country. So whenever we take our, US capital outflows would be money leaving the United States going into another country. And so what's called this term of capital inflows is the total inflows of a country plus outflows of a country. I know that's kind of confusing because we're saying inflows two times, capital inflows equals inflows plus outflows. But just remember capital inflows is, it could be negative or positive. So if we have a positive capital inflows, that means that more money is, if the United States had a positive capital inflows, that would mean that more money is coming into the United States than it's leaving. And then vice versa, if we had a negative capital inflows, that would mean that more money is leaving our country than is coming into our country. Okay, so just make sure you remember capital inflows is all looking at, the money leaving our country versus the money coming into our country. Another thing we're going to look at is liabilities and assets. And so liabilities and assets, a liability is money that you owe someone, okay? So if you have a liability, that could be a house payment, that could be a car payment. That just means that you owe someone money, okay? An asset is what you own. So the actual house would be your asset versus the mortgage that you have to pay off the bank. That would be the liability. Money that you put into your bank account, stocks that you own, all those are assets. So assets are what you own, and liabilities are what you owe other people. Okay, we're also going to look at qualities of financial assets. So this is kind of looking at what makes an asset, what are the good things about an asset and what are the bad things about an asset. And 3 different qualities we're going to look at are risk, return, and liquidity. So the first one is risk. So risk refers to how likely is it that you would lose a lot of money. Okay, so for example, a bank deposit, money that you put into like Wells Fargo, that has really, really low risk because since it's insured by the FDIC, there's a very, very, very low chance that you could lose that money. Basically, our entire economy, our entire government would have to collapse for you to lose the money that's in that bank account. Whereas stocks have a much higher risk because, very easily that stock could crash. Just think about whenever we have stock market crashes, you could lose all the value of that stock. So that kind of just shows you, people usually want to minimize their risk. So if we're only looking at risk, you would want to save your money in assets that have very low risk. One thing you can do to minimize your risk is what's called diversification, which means buying a lot of different types of assets. So for example, instead of putting all your money into just one company, into just Apple stock, you might buy as many different kinds of stock as you can. And then even if one stock fails, just because that one stock fails doesn't mean you lose all your money in the stock market. Or even better, not just putting your money only in stock, but buying bonds, buying some stocks, putting some of your money in bank deposits, really spreading out your money to minimize that risk. The next thing we're going to look at is return. Okay, and so return is how much could you potentially gain? You might not necessarily earn that much money, but how much money is it possible for you to earn on top of your initial savings amount? So for example, again, bank deposits, they have really, really low return because usually, Wells Fargo, when you put your money in the bank, they're going to offer you a 0.05% return on your investment. So your $100 might be worth $100 and a few cents next year. And that the reason for that is because they're so low risk, they're going to be low return as well. Whereas stocks, they really have to offer that high return. The only reason people would put their money in a high risk savings asset is because there's a possibility of getting a high return also. So with a stock, you could lose a lot of money if it tanks, if it fails, but there's also the chance that if the stock does well, you could earn a lot of money. Whereas that bank deposit, you're probably not going to lose it, but you're really also not going to earn much money on it either. The last kind of quality of an asset we're going to look at is what's called liquidity, and that refers to how quickly can you convert that asset into actual cash, into literal hard cold cash that you can hold in your hand. So for example, bank deposits and stocks are really highly liquid because you can easily, you can go to your bank that day that you need money, withdraw money, and you have it in your hand. And even stocks, you can just go online, you sell your stock, and you'll get that money transferred to your bank account really, really quickly. So both of those assets would be something that's liquid. And the reason liquidity is a good thing is because, people want access to their money. If something were to happen and they need their money, something that has high liquidity is going to be more useful than something that takes, weeks and weeks to get your money out of. So for example, a house would have really low liquidity because, you can't just sell your house. There aren't hundreds of people, at any one time who are willing to buy your house. It could take you days, weeks, or even months to find a buyer who's willing to buy your house. Whereas even stocks, if you have Apple stock, you can sell it right away and it's going to be bought up. You're not going to have to wait a week for people to buy your Apple stock. Okay, so that's another thing to keep into account is how liquid is that asset. And usually, high liquidity is preferable over low liquidity. So now we're going to take a look at the different types of assets. A couple of these should be very familiar, so we're just going to kind of go through them really quickly to make sure you have a good understanding of all the different types, or some of the different types of assets, the most common types of assets. The first one we're going to look at is a loan, and that's just whenever um, you either might give someone money, let someone borrow money to buy something, or in reverse, you borrow money from someone else. So for a loan, the main thing you need to know is that if someone owes you money, then that loan would be an asset for you because that's basically something that you own. You are going to get money from that. Whereas it would be a liability for them because they owe you the money. Okay. On the converse, if you have a car loan, you borrowed money from the bank, then for you, that loan is a liability because you owe money to the bank. And for the bank, that loan is an asset. So just remember, a loan is always it's always an asset for someone, and it's always a liability for the borrower. Another type of asset is a bond. Okay, so a bond is really kind of like an IOU, and it's kind of like a loan. It basically means that you lent money to someone, and in this case for bonds, it's always going to be a government or a corporation. So the government, whenever they need, whenever they've spent more than they took in tax revenue and they have to finance that deficit, then they're going to issue bonds. You're going to let the government borrow their money, so they borrow your money so they can pay off all their expenses. Or even corporations a lot of times will issue bonds. If AT&T is wanting to build a new service center, instead of going to a bank, because they're a large enough company, they might issue their own bonds, and you might let AT&T borrow your money to build their service center. And the reason you would do that is because you would usually only want to give your money to companies that are highly established, that are fairly confident that they're not going to go bankrupt in the next few years, because you want to make sure you get your money back. There are bonds called junk bonds, which are really small companies that issue bonds. And those are because they're really risky because those companies aren't well established. Let's say, someone just like sets up a business in their garage and they need to borrow money, but they don't want to go to a bank. In theory, they could issue a junk bond. You could give them money and they would give you a bond, basically an IOU that says they're going to pay you back. But because there's a really high risk that their business could fail, they're also going to have to offer really, really high return. They're going to pay you a really high interest rate on that bond. But just remember, a bond is like an IOU. Basically, you let someone borrow money from you, and then in exchange, they promise to pay you back at a later date plus interest. Okay. Also, a lot of times, school districts and cities will issue bonds to pay for things that might not be in the budget. So if you remember, a couple of years ago, I think it was maybe last year, the Red Oak tried to get that bond to build that big sports complex, and that failed. People basically decided that they didn't want to let the government, they didn't want to give that much money to the city. But like Red Oak itself, whenever they want to build new schools, they're going to issue bonds as well. And there should be, in this next election coming up in May, there's going to be a bond to see if the taxpayers of the Red Oak School District will give more money to the school in exchange for the school building a new middle school. Bonds do, though, they have a risk of default. So, the government has a really, really low risk of default. It's a pretty safe savings for your money. Even like big corporations are going to usually have a low risk of default. But as that company gets riskier and riskier, it has that higher risk of default. And so they're going to have to offer a higher return on your investment to get you to let them borrow your money. You also have bank deposits, and bank deposits are just money that you put in like a savings account or a checking account. It's basically you giving your money to the bank or letting the bank borrow your money, and then they're going to take that money and they're going to lend it out to other people in order to make a profit off of it. But when you put your money in a bank deposit, that's an asset for you. And then we have stocks, and stocks are basically, just you own a portion of a company. So, for example, you could buy one share of Apple stock, and that means that you own like 0.00001% of the Apple Corporation. And the more stock that you own, then the larger portion of that company that you own. One benefit of stock, there's a couple of different benefits. What you want to do with stock is that you want to buy low and sell high. So you want to buy stock when it's really cheap, and then the hope is that that stock will become more and more valuable because the company will grow, the company will do well. And then at a later date, you can sell that stock for a higher price, and the difference between the purchase and the sell price, that's your profit. Also, some stocks pay dividends. So when Apple makes a profit, if Apple made a profit in 2016, then they're going to take a portion of their profits and they're going to give it to their shareholders because, you are an owner of a company. And just like the owner of a company gets the profit, so too do the shareholders because they are the owners of that company by owning that piece of stock. Now, another type of asset is what's called a loan-backed security. And this one's a little bit more difficult. This might not be one that you've ever heard of. But basically what it is that a whole bunch of loans are grouped together, and then those loans as a group are sold off. So for example, let's say we're talking about what are called mortgage loan-backed securities, mortgage-backed securities. What that basically means is that a bank gave mortgages to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. So this bank has hundreds of these different mortgages. Now, as someone who's trying to figure out where to put your money, you probably wouldn't want to buy an individual mortgage because then you're putting, all your money on the hope that that one person would pay off their mortgage. And that's pretty risky. So what banks sometimes will do is they'll take all these different loans, they'll package them together, all these mortgages, package them together, and then they'll sell that package off to hundreds of people. So when you buy that package of that loan-backed security, you're basically buying a tiny percentage of Joe's mortgage and a tiny percentage of Sarah's mortgage and a tiny percentage of Rachel's mortgage. You're buying tiny percentages of hundreds and hundreds of people's mortgages because while it might be, it's pretty risky to buy one person's mortgage, there's a very low chance that a lot of those people will default on their mortgages because usually mortgages are pretty safe. But you don't, you can do that with more than just mortgage-backed securities. You could do that with any type of loan. The problem with loan-backed securities is it's really hard to determine how risky they are. So for example, those mortgage-backed securities, usually mortgages are really safe, and that would be a really safe place to put your money. The problem is, though, for example, in 2008, what happened is that these banks started giving mortgages to people who really couldn't afford those homes. People who were making maybe $50,000 a year got a mortgage for a $400,000 house. So they packaged all these mortgages together, which were called subprime mortgages. They were really, really risky. All of them had a really high risk of default. And then they packaged them together. But when they sold them, they said, hey, these are mortgages. Mortgages are really safe. These are A grade, not risky at all. And so when people bought these mortgage-backed securities, they thought they were buying a really good loan, basically, when in reality they were buying really, really terrible ones that had really high risk of default. And so then in 2008, when all these people stopped paying their mortgages because they got too expensive and all those loans started failing, people all of a sudden, these loans that they thought were really, really safe that they had bought ended up failing and they ended up losing all their money, which that's kind of the 2008 recession in a nutshell. But so yeah, that's kind of the main risk of loan-backed securities is you're not always really sure what you're buying unless you want to take the hours and hours and hours of time to really dig into that loan-backed security, which most people don't do. They just say, hey, this is given an A because it's supposed to be a mortgage-backed security. It's supposed to be safe. And it turns out it's not safe. Next thing we're going to talk about are financial intermediaries. And these are basically just people who they take money from individuals and then they transform it into a financial asset that can't be bought by one individual person. So for example, let me give you a couple examples and I'll show you what I mean by that. The first thing we're going to talk about is a mutual fund. So earlier I mentioned how diversification is a really good thing, how you don't want to just buy Apple stock. You would want to buy some Apple stock, some Microsoft stock, some Ford stock, some GMC stock. And if you diversify, then if one of those stocks fails, you won't lose all your money. The problem is, though, is that, for example, stock is really expensive. One share of Apple stock might cost several $100s. And so if you're trying to buy hundreds of different companies' stocks, that might cost you, $1 million to do that. Well, most people, most regular people don't have $1 million to diversify their own stock portfolio. So what a financial intermediary, what a mutual fund will do is that the mutual fund person who runs it, they will take a whole bunch of money from hundreds of different people. Each person might chip in 100 or 200 or 1,000. They'll all add up their money, and then the mutual fund the person who runs it, they will buy with that large amount of money hundreds of different stocks, and then basically sell off, those stocks, sell off that bundle. So basically, you then buy a share of that fund. You own 1% of an Apple stock, and 1% of a Microsoft stock, and 1% of a Ford stock, which you can't do on your own. You can't just go and, buy 1% of a Ford stock. But when you buy the share of that mutual fund, that's basically what you're doing. So it really minimizes your risk because you're diversifying your portfolio. Even though you couldn't do it on your own, you can do it with the mutual fund. And then I have on here what's called an ETF. That's just something for when you actually start thinking about putting your money into like mutual funds. There's also something called an ETF, which is similar to a mutual fund. It's just a little bit different because they have lower fees, and you're basically buying like on the stock market. If you have more questions about that, I can come talk to you about ETFs. I just wanted to know it's something similar to a mutual fund. It's just run a little bit different way. Also, pension funds. Pension funds are a type of financial intermediary, which is basically where you're taking your money, and each month you're gonna put a little bit of your money into that pension fund, and then the person who runs the pension fund, they're gonna take that money, and they're gonna take it from you and all the other people who are putting their money into that pension fund, and they're gonna go out and they're gonna buy different stocks, and they're gonna buy different bonds, and they're gonna manage it for years and years and years and years, and then when you get ready to retire, you will be paid. They're going to start selling off some of those stocks, and they'll sell off some of those bonds, and you'll get paid a set amount each month as retirement income. Now, these days, most average companies don't offer pension funds. Mostly, now pension funds are really only given by the government. So like if you're a teacher, there's what's called TRS, which is a pension fund. If you're a firefighter or a police officer, you'll usually have a pension fund as well. And then some really large companies like ExxonMobil have pension funds for their employees. But most companies these days don't have pension funds. You'll put your money, if you're an average person, you'll probably put your money into like a 401k or an IRA, and then with that money you can buy mutual funds, and you're basically just having to like manage your own retirement income. Whereas a pension fund is something that's supposed to be like promised to you no matter what happens to those stocks. And then the last financial intermediary we're going to talk about are banks. And basically the bank itself, you're giving your money to a bank, and then they're taking that money and transforming it into a loan by loaning it out to someone else. So the bank itself is a financial intermediary because they're taking money from hundreds of different people, and they might transform it into a loan for one company to build a new building. Maybe a company that's too small to issue their own bond, they're going to the bank to get a loan instead. Okay. All right, so that's all I have for you for, this was basically kind of a summary of Module 22. Now, there's still a lot of stuff in Module 22, some details that we didn't talk about, so make sure you read Module 22 and take notes. But these are kind of the high points to understand how, the financial markets in terms of your assets and your liabilities, how all that works. Okay? Bye, guys.